The station was dying, and everyone inside knew it. Varanthos Station hung in the cold darkness of space like a wounded animal waiting for the final blow to fall upon it. Surrounded by the green glow of enemy warships that had been firing upon it for 3 standard cycles without rest or mercy inside the station. 2,000 souls from 17 different species huddled together in corridors that grew colder with each passing hour as the life support systems failed one by one like candles, being blown out by an invisible wind. Commander Celis Vorn stood near the back of the main command center and watched the alien officers around him with a calm expression that hid the storm building inside his chest. A storm that would soon break free and change everything. He had not planned to be here when the siege began, for he was merely a human military attaché visiting on diplomatic business. A simple mission that should have lasted only a few days before he returned home to Earth. But fate had other plans, and now he was trapped along with everyone else. Watching the shields flicker and fail as the Cathari Dominion's armada pounded the station with plasma fire that painted the void in sickly shades of green and yellow. The Tovani were the first to freeze completely when the breach alarms began to sound. Throughout the station, these beautiful crystalline beings stood like statues made of living glass, their bodies chiming a frequency of pure despair that made Vorn's teeth ache. For their kind had evolved over millions of years to become perfectly still when danger approached, believing that if they did not move, then death would pass them by. The Makari officers had gone silent at their stations, their mechanical minds calculating and recalculating the odds of survival until their logic circuits simply gave up and accepted the 0% probability that their mathematics revealed. Even the massive Gorthian warriors, creatures that stood over 3 meters tall and were renowned across the entire galaxy for their strength and courage in battle, had become paralyzed by what they were witnessing. Vorn had never seen a Gorthian afraid before this moment, and he found that it disturbed him more than the enemy fleet outside. The station shook violently as another barrage struck the weakening shields, and somewhere in the distance metal screamed as hull plates began to buckle under the relentless assault. Sector 7 has been breached, announced the station's artificial intelligence in a voice that remained calm and pleasant even as it delivered news of their doom. Enemy boarding parties are now entering the station through multiple access points, and estimated time until they reach the command center is 47 minutes. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody breathed. The fear in that room was a physical thing that Vorn could almost taste on his tongue, a weight that pressed down upon every being present and held them frozen in place like insects trapped in amber. Every being except Vorn pushed himself away from the wall where he'd been leaning and began walking toward the equipment lockers near the main door, his boots making soft sounds against the metal floor that seemed impossibly loud in the terrible silence. The Torvani ambassador, a being called Crystalline Voice of Dawn, managed to turn her head, just enough to watch him move past her, her compound eyes reflecting his image 1,000 times over. "What are you doing?" she asked in a voice that barely registered above a whisper. Vorn did not answer immediately because he was too busy pulling open the equipment locker and examining what was inside, which turned out to be salvaged armor pieces that did not quite fit together properly, and a standard-issue plasma rifle with exactly 93 rounds remaining. Not much against an army of Cathari hunters, he thought to himself, but it would have to be enough. "Commander Vorn," the ambassador tried again, her crystalline body chiming with notes of confusion and fear. "The Cathari hunting parties are coming, and they will tear through these corridors like water through sand, and there is nothing that can stop them." "I know," Vorn replied as he began strapping on the armor, checking each seal with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had done this 1,000 times before. That is exactly why someone needs to slow them down. The Makari tactical officer finally spoke, his voice carrying the flat tone of pure logic. One being against 16 HFY warriors represents a survival probability of less than 0.03%, and that calculation assumes optimal conditions, which do not currently exist. I have heard worse odds, Bourne said, and he meant it because he had faced worse on Titan during the mining colony, uprising, and again on Europa when the ice storms came, and once more on a dozen other worlds where humanity had learned to survive against everything the universe threw at them. The Gorthian war chief, a massive creature covered in battle scars from 100 conflicts, finally found his voice, but it came out as something close to a growl. You cannot succeed alone, human, and you know this truth as well as we do. Vorn finished securing his armor and picked up the plasma rifle, feeling its familiar weight in his hands like an old friend that had never let him down. And then he turned to face the assembled aliens, who were all staring at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been the beginning of hope. "You are probably right," he admitted freely. "But here is the thing that you need to understand about humans, and about me specifically." He walked toward the main bulkhead door that led to Sector 7, where the enemy was even now pouring into the station like a flood of death and destruction. My species spent 200,000 years being afraid of absolutely everything that existed in our world, he said as he reached the door controls. We were afraid of the dark because we could not see what was hiding in it, and we were afraid of the cold because it could kill us while we slept, and we were afraid of every predator with teeth and claws because we had neither. He placed his hand on the door release and paused for just a moment. But we learned something that the rest of the galaxy apparently never had to learn. He continued. We learned that fear does not mean you stop moving. He opened the door, and the corridor beyond was already filling with smoke from the fires that the breach had started. Fear means you move faster. And then Commander Celis Vorn walked into the smoke and the fire and the darkness, leaving behind a room full of frozen aliens who could only watch him go and wonder if they had just witnessed the bravest act in the history of the galaxy, or the most foolish. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and for a long moment, nobody in the command center moved or spoke. Then, very slowly, the Gorthian war chief reached for his weapon. The corridor stretched before Celis Vorn like the throat of some great beast waiting to swallow him whole, and he walked into it anyway, because that was what humans did when there was no other choice. Smoke filled the air so thick that he could barely see 3 meters in front of his face, and the emergency lights had failed in this section, which meant he was moving through darkness, lit only by the occasional spark of damaged electrical systems and the distant glow of fires that burned where they should not burn. His heart was pounding so hard in his chest that he could hear it even over the sound of the station groaning around him, and his hands were shaking slightly as they gripped the plasma rifle, but he did not stop moving forward, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant everyone else on this station would follow him into the void. The HFY were coming, and he could hear them now. Their hunting calls echoed through the damaged corridors like the screams of nightmares given form, a sound that had made entire civilizations surrender without a fight, because evolution had programmed those species to freeze when they heard it, to become still and silent and hope that death would pass them by. Vorn felt that instinct pulling at him too, because humans were not immune to fear, no matter what the story said, and every cell in his body was screaming at him to hide, to find a dark corner and curl up and wait for the end. But humans had learned long ago that hiding did not save you from predators, that playing dead only worked until the predator decided to make sure you were actually dead, and that the only real chance of survival was to become so dangerous that the predators learned to fear you instead. He reached a junction where 3 corridors met, and paused to check his tactical display, which showed the enemy positions as red dots moving steadily. Toward the command center, where 2,000 helpless beings waited for rescue or death. 16 HFY warriors in the main hunting party, with more behind them than each. One of those warriors was a perfect killing machine that had been bred for war over countless generations. The HFY stood 3 meters tall on average, with armored carapaces that could shrug off. Most small arms fire and blade limbs that could cut through steel plating like it was made of paper, and compound eyes that could see in almost complete darkness. They were apex predators from a death world, where everything that lived was designed to kill everything else, and they had conquered 100 systems through sheer biological superiority, and Silas Vorn was going to fight them with salvaged armor that did not fit properly and a plasma rifle with 93 rounds. The math did not work out in his favor, but math had never stopped a human before. He chose the center corridor because it offered the most cover and began moving again, keeping low and quiet, using every bit of training that the Earth Defense Force had drilled into him over 15 years of service. Behind him, in the command center, he knew the aliens were still frozen, and he did not blame them for it because their fear was as real as his own, and they had not spent 200,000 years learning to fight through it, the way humans had. The Torvani ambassador had looked at him like he was insane when he walked toward the door, and maybe she was right, because sanity said you did not walk alone into a fight you could not win, but sanity also said you did not cross oceans in wooden ships or climb mountains that touch the sky or strap yourself to controlled explosions and fly to other worlds. And humans had done all of those things and more because they refused to let fear make their decisions for them. The first HFY scout appeared at the end of the corridor, and Vorn dropped to one knee behind a fallen support beam, steadying his rifle and controlling his breathing the way he had been taught. The scout was smaller than the warriors, but still massive by human standards, and it was sweeping the corridor with sensor equipment that would detect him in approximately 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2 seconds. From fired, the plasma bolt caught the scout in the joint between its head and thorax, where the armor was weakest, and the creature went down with a shriek that echoed through the station like a thunderclap. So much for stealth, Vorn thought, as he was already moving to a new position, because staying still after firing was a guaranteed way to die. Hunting calls changed pitch, and he knew the main party had heard the scout die, and they were coming now, all 16 of them converging on his position with the single-minded focus of predators who had just found prey good. He thought as he checked his ammunition count, which now read 92. The more attention they pay to me, the less they pay to the command center. He found a maintenance alcove and pressed himself into it just as the first warriors came around the corner, their blade limbs clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm that sounded like death approaching. They were magnificent in a terrible way. These HFY hunters, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for creatures their size, and their armor gleamed in the emergency, lighting like the shells of beetles from some fever dream. The pack leader was the largest of them, standing nearly 3.5 meters tall, with scars across its carapace that spoke of countless battles won, and it was directing the others with subtle movements of its blade limbs, spreading them out to search for the thing that had killed their scout. They did not expect that thing to attack them in 10,000 years of recorded HFY history. No single prey creature had ever attacked a hunting party. And why would they, when the smart thing to do was run or hide or surrender and hope for a quick death? Silas Vorn was not smart. He was human. He stepped out of the alcove with his rifle raised and began firing into the hunting party with calm precision. Each shot aimed at the weak points in their armor. Each pull of the trigger another act of defiance against a universe that said he should be cowering and feared. First warrior fell before it even knew it was under attack, and the second spun around, with a blade limb raised only to take a plasma bolt through its compound eye, and the third managed to charge 3 steps toward him before Vaughn put it down as well. Then the pack leader did something that had never been recorded in the long history of the Cathari Dominion. It stepped backward, not much. Just a single step, but it was enough to make the other warriors hesitate, because their leader had shown uncertainty, and uncertainty was not something that apex predators were supposed to feel. Vern used that moment of hesitation to fall back toward a side corridor. Still firing, still moving, still refusing to give them an easy target. 81 rounds remaining. A long way still to go. The plasma conduit ruptured 3 meters ahead of Silas Vorn, and suddenly the corridor became an inferno that no living thing should be able to survive. Flames roared from the broken pipe with temperatures that exceeded 500 degrees, and the heat hit him like a physical wall that tried to push him back toward the Cathari warriors who were closing in behind him with murder in their compound eyes. He had maybe 2 seconds to make a choice, and neither option was good. Behind him were 12 remaining hunters who had recovered from their initial shock and were now very angry about the 4 dead warriors he had left scattered across the corridors, and they would tear him apart if they caught him. Ahead of him was fire that would cook him alive inside his armor if he tried to pass through it. 2 seconds became 1 second, and then there was no more time for thinking. Vaughn ran straight into the flames. The heat was beyond anything he had ever experienced, and his armor immediately began to blister and warp as the outer layer tried to protect him from temperatures it was never designed to handle, and warning lights flashed across his visor telling him things he already knew about how close he was to death. His left arm caught a direct blast from the ruptured conduit, and he felt something snap inside it, but he kept moving. Kept pushing forward through the wall of fire, because the only alternative was stopping, and stopping meant burning. 3 seconds inside the inferno felt like 3 hours, and when he finally burst through the other side, he was trailing smoke, and his armor was partially melted to his skin in places, and his left arm hung at an angle that told him it was broken in at least 2 places. But he was alive, and the Cathari were still on the other side of the firewall, trying to figure out how to get around it, because their hunting instincts were screaming at them that nothing could survive what they had just witnessed. The pack leader reached the edge of the flames and stopped, its compound eyes tracking the smoke trail that Vorn had left behind him. And for the first time in its long life, it felt something that its species had never needed to evolve. Doubt. How did prey survive that? Some ancient part of its brain was asking. How did something so small and soft walk through fire and keep moving? And why was it not screaming in agony the way all prey was supposed to scream? Vorn did not give them time to figure out the answers. He found cover behind a cargo container and checked his weapon, which was still functional despite the heat damage, and then he began picking off the hunters as they tried to find ways around the fire, using his knowledge of the station's layout to predict where they would emerge and putting plasma bolts into them before they could reach him. 64 rounds remaining after he dropped another warrior who had tried to use a ventilation shaft to flank him. The Cathari were adapting now because they were not stupid creatures, and they had begun to treat him as a real threat instead of simple prey, which meant they were being more careful and moving in coordinated patterns that were harder to counter. But their caution was costing them time, and time was what Vorn was really fighting for. Every minute he kept them focused on him was another minute that the beings in the command center had to prepare or escape or do whatever they needed to do to survive this nightmare. His broken arm was screaming at him with every movement, and he could feel blood running down his side from where a piece of shrapnel had found a gap in his damaged armor. But pain was just information, and he had been trained to process information without letting it control him. The pack leader finally found a path around the fire and came at him from an angle he had not expected, moving faster than something that size should be able to move. and Vorn barely managed to roll aside before the blade limb came down where his head had been a moment earlier. He fired 3 shots point blank into the creature's underbelly where the armor was thinnest, and the pack leader staggered, but did not fall because it was the strongest of its kind, and it had survived worse than plasma burns. The blade limb came around again, and this time it caught Vorn across the chest, tearing through his damaged armor and opening a wound that immediately began to pump blood onto the floor in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He should have died in that moment. The pack leader certainly expected him to die because it had killed thousands of prey creatures with that exact strike, and every single one of them had fallen and stayed down. Vorn did not fall. He stepped forward into the creature's guard where its blade limbs could not reach him effectively and pressed his rifle against the soft tissue beneath its jaw and pulled the trigger until the weapon clicked. Empty. The pack leader of the Kethari hunting party collapsed with a sound like a mountain falling, and Vorn stood over its body, breathing hard and bleeding harder and wondering how much longer he could keep going. 51 rounds in his backup magazine after he reloaded. 8 hunters remaining. He started moving again because standing still was dying, and dying was not something he was ready to do. Yet the remaining Kethari had witnessed their pack leader fall to this impossible creature that walked through fire and kept fighting no matter how much damage it took, and something was happening to them that their species had no framework to understand. They were becoming afraid. Fear was supposed to be something that prey felt, not hunters. But watching this human refuse to die was triggering responses in their brains that had been dormant for millions of years. Ancient memories of a time before their species became the apex predators of their world. Vorn could see it in the way they moved now. Hesitant where before they had been confident, careful where before they had been aggressive. And he used that hesitation against them the same way his ancestors had used fire and sharpened sticks against the predators of ancient Earth. He led them on a chase through maintenance tunnels and cargo bays, using the station's geography to limit how many could attack him at once, picking them off one by one with shots that he could not afford to miss because every round was precious now. By the time he reached Cargo Bay 7, he had killed 4 more, and his ammunition count read 23. And his body was failing in ways that he did not have time to catalog. He put his back against the bulkhead and raised his rifle toward the corridor, where the last 4 hunters would eventually appear, and waited for the end that he knew was coming. At least he had given the others a chance. He thought as his vision began to blur around the edges. At least he had done something that mattered. The sound of footsteps made him tighten his finger on the trigger. But then he realized that these footsteps were too heavy for Kethari, and too numerous and coming from the wrong direction. He turned his head slowly because fast movements hurt too much now, and saw something that made him wonder if he was already dead, and hallucinating a wall of Gorthian warriors was advancing down the corridor toward him with weapons raised, and behind them came Makari soldiers moving in perfect tactical formation, and behind them were Torvani with rifles in their crystalline hands. Rifles that their species had not touched in 10,000 years of peace. Took you long enough, Vorn said, and if his voice cracked, nobody mentioned it. In the command center of Varanto Station, the silence had stretched for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds after Commander Silas Vorn walked through the door and disappeared into the smoke. Crystalline voice of Dawn stood frozen in place like a statue made of living glass, and her mind was caught in a loop that kept replaying the same moment over and over again. The moment when a single human had looked at certain death and walked toward it anyway. This was not how intelligent beings were supposed to behave. Every species in the Galactic Coalition had evolved survival instincts that told them to freeze when danger appeared, to become small and quiet and wait for the threat to pass, because that strategy had worked for millions of years across thousands of worlds. The human had ignored all of that ancient wisdom and simply walked into the fired, the first gunshots echoed through the station's communication system, and everyone in the command center heard them. Sharp, crackling sounds that meant the human had found the enemy, or the enemy had found him. Then came the hunting. Screams of the Cathari, and those screams contained something that crystalline voice of Dawn had never heard before in all her centuries of diplomatic service. Confusion. The apex predators were confused because their prey was not behaving like prey, and that confusion was bleeding into their hunting calls like a wrong note in a familiar song. More gunshots, followed by a Cathari death shriek, and then another, and then a third, and the Makari tactical officer spoke in a voice that contained something very close to wonder. He has killed 3 of them already, the Makari said as it processed the audio data. The human has killed 3 Cathari warriors in less than 90 seconds of combat. The Gorthian war chief stirred like a mountain waking from a long sleep, and his massive hands slowly curled into fists that could crush stone. He fights alone, the Gorthian rumbled, and his voice carried the weight of shame that his people had not felt since the ancient times before they became warriors. One small, soft creature fights against the hunters while we stand here and do nothing. Another death shriek came through the speakers, followed by the sound of plasma conduits rupturing, and then something that made every being in the room draw in a sharp breath. The sound of a human running through fire. The sensors showed the temperature spike, and the surveillance systems that still functioned captured a blurry image of a figure emerging from an inferno that should have killed anything organic, and that figure was still moving, still fighting, still refusing to die. How is this possible? Crystalline voice of Dawn whispered, and her crystals were vibrating with frequencies she did not recognize. Emotions that her species had buried so deep that she had never felt them before. How does he continue when all logic says he should have fallen? The Makari tactical officer was running calculations that kept returning impossible results. His species evolved on a world where they were not the apex predators, and their survival required them to override the freeze response that protected other species. They learned to process fear as a signal to act rather than a signal to stop. That is insanity, said a Torveni diplomat whose crystals were chiming with pure disbelief. Fear exists to protect us from danger. For your species, yes, the Makari replied. But humans face dangers that could not be waited out. Predators that would find them no matter how still they remained. Environmental threats that would kill them if they did not move. So they evolved a different response. Fear became fuel for action rather than a command to freeze. Another Cathari fell somewhere in the station, and the hunting calls were changing again, becoming something that none of them had ever heard before. The hunters were becoming the hunted. The Gorthian war chief made a sound deep in his chest that was the beginning of a battle cry, and he reached for the ceremonial weapon that hung at his side, a blade that had not tasted blood in 3 generations. I will not stand here while a creature half my size shows more courage than my entire species, the Gorthian declared, and his voice was strong now. Strong in a way it had not been since the siege began. I am War Chief Gorthan, and my ancestors would spit upon me if I let this human die alone. He began walking toward the door that Vorn had used, and his footsteps shook the floor with each stridey crystalline voice of Dawn felt something moving inside her, something ancient and forgotten. A feeling that her peaceful species had evolved away from over 10,000 years of civilization. It was the urge to fight. The human has reduced enemy combat effectiveness by 43%, the Makari tactical officer announced, as if reaching a logical conclusion. If we provide support, our combined forces would have a 78% chance of victory. Then we would win, crystalline voice of Dawn said, and the words felt strange in her mouth but also right in a way she could not explain. If we fight together, we would win. She moved toward the weapons locker before she fully understood what she was doing, and her crystalline fingers closed around a plasma rifle that felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light at the same time. The other Tovani in the room watched her with expressions of shock, because their species had been pacifists for 100 centuries, and what she was doing went against everything they had been taught since birth. But then one of them moved to join her, and then another still, until every Tovani in the command center was armed and ready for something they had never been ready for before the Makari formed perfect tactical lines, because that was what their logic demanded, and the Gorthians roared battle cries that had not been heard since the great wars of ancient times, and together they all moved through the door, and into the smoke they found Vorn in Cargo Bay 7, surrounded by the bodies of Cathari warriors. And he was leaning against the bulkhead with his rifle pointed at the corridor where the last 4 hunters would come, and his armor was destroyed and his body was broken, but his eyes were still clear. "Took you long enough," he said in a voice that wavered but did not break. War Chief Gorthan stepped forward and placed himself between the human and the corridor like a living shield. "You should have waited for us, human," Morn laughed, which turned into a cough, which turned into a wheeze. "Did not think you were coming." "Neither did we," crystalline voice of Dawn admitted as she took position beside the Gorthian with her rifle raised. "But you showed us something we had forgotten." "What is that?" "That fear is not the end," she said, and her crystals were singing now with harmonics of courage and defiance. "Fear is just the beginning." The last 4 Cathari hunters appeared at the end of the corridor and found themselves facing an army, where before there had been only 1 wounded human. They did not survive the encounter. The Coalition fleet arrived 16 hours after the last Cathari hunter fell, and found something that none of them had expected to find: survivors. 2,000 beings from 17 species stood on the docking platforms as the rescue ships connected to Varanthos Station, and they were not cowering or crying or showing the trauma that usually marked siege survivors. They were standing tall with weapons in their hands and pride in their eyes. Admiral Kethris of the Coalition Navy was the first to step aboard the station, and the Tovani officer had prepared herself for the aftermath of slaughter, for the broken bodies and shattered spirits that always followed a Cathari boarding action. Instead, she found Gorthian warriors celebrating with battle songs that had not been sung in generations, and Makari soldiers calculating victory statistics with obvious satisfaction, and Tovani diplomats holding plasma rifles like they had been born with them in their crystalline hands. "Report," Admiral Kethris commanded, because she needed to understand what had happened here. Crystalline voice of Dawn stepped forward as the ranking diplomatic official, and her voice carried across the docking bay like music made of light. "The Cathari boarding parties have been eliminated to the last warrior," she said, and there was no hesitation in her words. "All 47 of them. 47 Cathari hunters eliminated by a civilian population." The Admiral repeated slowly, because the words did not make sense. "How is that possible?" "It should not have been possible," the Makari tactical officer interjected with precise logic. "Our initial survival probability was calculated at 0%, and there was no rational reason to believe we could resist the hunters." Then, what changed? Everyone on the docking platform turned to look at a medical stretcher that was being prepared for transport to the fleet hospital ship, and the figure lying on that stretcher was small by galactic standards. Smaller than a Tovani, and far smaller than a Gorthian commander. Silas Vorn was barely conscious, but he managed to lift one bandaged hand in a weak wave when he noticed everyone staring at him. One human changed everything, War Chief Gorthan declared, and his voice rumbled through the bay like thunder. When all of us stood frozen in fear, this human walked through fire and fought the hunters alone. Alone. The Admiral repeated. For nearly 2 hours he engaged the enemy by himself and killed 8 warriors, including their pack leader, before we finally overcame our own cowardice and joined him. Gorthan continued, and his words were heavy with respect. He gave us time, and more importantly, he showed us that fear does not have to mean surrender. Admiral Kethris approached the stretcher, where human medical officers were preparing Vorn for transport, and she looked down at this small creature who had somehow turned certain defeat into impossible victory. Commander Vorn, she said formally, the Galactic Coalition is in your debt. Vorn opened his eyes, which were clouded with pain. Medication, but still held a spark of something that the Admiral recognized as determination. Just did my job, he mumbled. Everyone else did the hard part. That is not how the story will be told. Crystalline voice of Dawn said softly, and she was right. The story spread across the galaxy like wildfire in the weeks and months that followed. And it was told in crystalline songs on Tovani Prime, where children learned for the first time that their ancestors had once known how to fight, and that courage was not something they had lost forever. The story was analyzed in Makari, logic temples, where scholars debated the implications of a species that had evolved to use fear as motivation. And the debates led to new theories about survival and psychology that would influence their science for generations. The story was roared in Gorthian mead halls, where warriors raised their cups to the human who had reminded them what it meant to be brave, and they swore oaths that they would never again let fear make them forget their duty. The Galactic Council demanded an explanation for what had happened on Varanto Station and the Coalitions. Xenopsychologists struggled to translate the answer into terms that other species could comprehend. Their final report was hundreds of pages long, but the essential conclusion fit into a single paragraph. Humans do not experience fear as a cessation response, and they do not interpret danger as a signal to become still and silent. Instead, they experience fear as fuel for action, and they interpret danger as a signal to fight harder and move faster. This is not bravery in the way that other species understand bravery. This is something older and deeper. This is the survival instinct of a species that learned 200,000 years ago that hiding would not save them, and that the only way to survive was to become more dangerous than the things that hunted them. Commander Silas Vorn received 17 medals from 17 species during a ceremony held at the Coalition headquarters, and he accepted them quietly while still limping from injuries that the doctors said would take months to fully heal. When reporters asked how he felt about his new title, he simply shrugged with his one good shoulder. Ghost of War. A journalist repeated, the Gathari survivors named you this, and it has spread to every corner of known space. How does it feel to be called that? Strange, Vorn admitted. I was just the first one to move, and everyone else followed and did the real work. But you walked through fire when everyone else was frozen. That is what humans do, he said simply. We get scared, and then we move anyway, because we learned a long time ago that standing still is not survival. Standing still is just dying slowly. The Tovani ambassador was watching from the crowd, and she thought about that answer for a long time afterward. She thought about the ancient days when her species had been prey on their home world, and how they had evolved to become perfectly still when predators approached, because that strategy had worked well enough to let them survive. She thought about the humans and their death world, where nothing worked well enough and where survival had required something different, something that looked like madness from the outside, but was actually the most desperate kind of wisdom. And she thought about what it must be like to face fear, not as an enemy, but as an ally, to feel your heart pound and your hand shake, and then use that energy to run toward danger instead of away from it. The galaxy remembered Varanto Station for a long time after that day. They remembered that when all stood frozen, one human walked through fire, and they remembered why humanity's ancient Enemies had learned to fear the dark, not because of what lurked within it, but because of what emerged from it with fire in their eyes and weapons in their hands. Afraid and angry, and absolutely unstoppable, the title Ghost of War echoed through history from that day forward, and it served as a reminder to every species in the galaxy that there was a small blue world on the edge of known space that had produced something remarkable, a species that had learned to make fear their servant instead of their master, a species that walked through fire when all logic said they should stay frozen, a species called humanity, and the galaxy would never look at them the same way again.